Welcome to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we would be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. And now let's move on to our first story. Ava was walking home from work that day, carrying a small backpack and dreaming of a cold lemonade on the porch of their house. She was only 20, and there were endless horizons ahead of her. Plans for school, dreams of moving to the big city and becoming a journalist, writing about injustice and helping those whose voices were not heard. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans. She didn't immediately notice the police car that was slowly following her down the empty street. Her thoughts were somewhere far away, and only when she heard a sharp beep did Ava stop and look back. The policeman stopped the car and got out, his hand on his holster. "Documents," he said briefly. Her heart sank. She had heard stories, knew that such things happened, but she always thought that it was somewhere far away, in big cities where life was in full swing. Here, in their small town, everyone knew everyone else, and no one thought that something like this could happen. Ava slowly reached for her bag, trying not to make any sudden movements, as her mother had taught her. But something went wrong. Maybe it was the expression on her face, maybe the hesitant look. The policeman suddenly drew his weapon, and everything happened in a split second. A flash of pain, a bright light, then darkness. Ava woke up in the hospital a few days later. Her face was bandaged so that she could barely move. The noise of the machines around her, the muffled conversations of the nurses, it all seemed like a dream. The doctors explained that she had undergone a complex operation. A bullet had hit her face, and to save her life, surgeons were forced to reconstruct her jaw and eye. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what Ava felt when she realized she would never be able to move the same way again. The bullet had also grazed her spine, and now her future looked very different. Her dreams of journalism, of moving away, all of it had been shattered in an instant. In the eyes of her mother, who sat next to her, Ava saw a reflection of her new reality: pity, fear, and helplessness. But deep within that pain, anger was brewing, not just at that police officer, but at the entire system that allowed this to happen. Ava turned away from her mother and looked out the window, watching the raindrops roll down the glass. She knew there was a long road ahead of her, a road of recovery and struggle, but was she ready to accept it? Ava lay still, feeling every minute a lingering pain, as if her body belonged to someone else. The windows of the room barely let in the light of the autumn day, and the muffled voices of the nurses could be heard outside the door. She heard her mother talking to the doctor, but she couldn't bring herself to listen. Her thoughts were far away, in that moment when the bullet pierced the air and her life changed forever. The door opened and her mother quietly entered the room, her eyes downcast. The woman sat on the edge of the bed and gently touched her daughter's hand. Ava didn't react. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, as if she could find answers to all her questions there. "Ava," her mother whispered, her voice shaking, "you need to talk to a lawyer. Something needs to be done." "What to do?" Ava answered coldly, not even looking at her. "How can I fight this? I won't be able to walk anymore. I'm not who I was anymore." The mother sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "You're strong. You've always been strong. This isn't the end. This is—" Ava interrupted, a sudden surge of rage giving her strength. "You think this can all be fixed? That anyone is going to be held accountable for what happened? He's a cop, Mom, a white cop, and I'm a black girl who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who needs me?" Her voice broke and she buried her face in the pillow, holding back her tears with all her might. Her mother sat silently next to her, stroking her hand, not knowing what to say. A few hours later, a lawyer and a social worker walked into the room. The lawyer was an older white man with glasses, carrying a folder of papers under his arm. The social worker, a woman named Michelle, was black and immediately approached Ava with a gentle smile. "Ava, I'm Michelle. I'm here to help you through this. I know it's hard for you right now, but your mom and I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're going to fight through this." Ava studied her quietly. The woman's face was concerned and confident, but Ava couldn't bring herself to believe that fighting would change anything. She looked at the lawyer, who sat down across from her and got straight to the point. "We're preparing a lawsuit against the police," he began. "There are witnesses who saw that officer abuse his authority. We have grounds to say that it was racial profiling, but I have to be honest with you, Ava, these things happen. Ava replayed the moment when everything went wrong over and over in her head. She recalled that terrible day down to the smallest details, as if trying to find the key to the answer in them. Why did this happen to her? The image of the policeman in front of her eyes became clearer and clearer, his cold gaze, his tense hand on his holster, and most terrifying of all, his voice. She couldn't forget his voice. "Hey!" A rude, contemptuous voice broke her out of her thoughts as she walked home. Ava turned around and saw a police car slowly moving behind her. The policeman, a white male with a scowl on his face, opened the door and got out of the car. There was something threatening in his movements. "Documents," he demanded, not bothering to introduce himself. Ava froze, her heart beating faster. She knew she had to be careful, move slowly, speak calmly, not provoke, but inside, everything was boiling. Why her? Why was this happening to her again? To people like her? "What did I do?" she dared to ask, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. The policeman grimaced as if her words disgusted him. "Are you deaf?" He came closer, his hand already on his holster. "I said papers, now, or do you want trouble?" Ava slowly reached for her backpack, trying not to make any sudden movements, as she had always been taught, but the policeman seemed aggressive from the start. "Faster," he shouted, his voice growing louder and angrier. "Do you think you can disobey orders, or do you think the rules don't apply to people like you?" She froze, feeling a cold fear pierce her entire body. His words were laced with hatred. She knew what he was talking about, even if he didn't say it outright. For people like her, a black girl in a world where her life wasn't worth as much as anyone else's. I'm just going home," she said, her voice shaking. She knew she couldn't just leave, but staying was dangerous, too. The policeman stepped forward sharply, grabbing her arm. She barely managed to stay on her feet from his sudden jerk. "I said documents," he growled right in her face. His eyes were blazing with fury, as if any resistance from her, any attempt to explain, only fueled his hatred. "You damned slut, I order you." Ava tried to free her hand in horror, but he held it too tightly. It all happened so fast, she didn't have time to realize that her movements, her attempt to protect herself, had caused his hand to instantly be on the weapon. His cry rang out like a thunderclap, "Don't move, don't you dare move." And before she knew what was happening, a shot rang out. In an instant, the entire world, full of fury and horror, was plunged into a deafening silence. In the ward, Ava abruptly woke up from her thoughts, her breathing quickening. The image of the policeman, his scream, his cruel gaze, all of it was in her head, and she couldn't get rid of it. At that moment, the door opened again, and her mother came in with more news from the lawyer. But Ava didn't care. No justice, no trial could give her back what she had lost. "I can never forget this," she whispered, almost to herself. Her mother sat down next to her, her eyes full of pain. "We will fight, Ava," she said, her voice firm, but the tears glistening on her cheeks spoke of how deep the pain was. "We will get the truth. We can't let them do this just like that. This man must answer for what he did." Ava clenched her fists, her gaze returning to the window. The voice of that policeman kept playing in her head. He had ordered her to obey, but now she would not remain silent any longer. Ava felt herself getting hot. The memory of that terrible day kept popping up before her eyes. The image of the policeman, his sharp order, the fire of hatred in his eyes, all of it burned in her mind. She remembered every second when her life was divided into before and after, and it was at that moment that the policeman's decisive shot became the culmination of her nightmare. "Don't move!" His voice rolled like thunder. It was not just an order, it was the order of a man accustomed to power, who felt like he was the master of the situation. But Ava moved. Fear and self-preservation overwhelmed her as she tried to free herself from his grip, trying to explain that she was simply going home. But there was no room for explanation in the officer's eyes. There was no compassion, no desire to understand, only contempt and cold hatred. He yanked her arm sharply, as if to assert his authority. "I said don't move," he repeated, his voice even more menacing. Ava froze, her heart pounding in her chest so hard she was afraid it would be heard on the street. Fear gripped her, but her brain refused to believe that all this was actually happening. Her fingers slid into the backpack where her wallet with documents was. She did everything slowly, so as not to provoke even more aggression, but in the eyes of the policeman, every movement of hers looked like a threat. He was already ready to act. His hand nervously lay on the gun, ready to shoot at any second. "Are you hiding something? Are you hiding something?" The policeman shouted louder and louder, as if losing control of himself. His fingers tightened on his weapon, and his eyes were determined, as if he had already made up his mind and was not going to back down. Ava froze in place, raising her hands in submission, but it was all happening too fast. "No need, He didn't let her finish. Another second, and the air was torn apart by the deafening sound of a gunshot. Ava in the head with incredible force. For a moment, the world around her froze, sound disappeared, and everything in her head froze in silence. She fell to the ground, not realizing what had happened. It was as if the life had been ripped out of her body along with her pulse, which suddenly slowed. When Ava woke up in the hospital, the first thing she felt was a sharp, piercing cold. Doctors said she had miraculously survived, but her life would never be the same again. The bullet had grazed her cheekbone, passed over her head, but left her disabled. Her face was changed forever. After the operation, Ava no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Her jaw was damaged, and she could barely open her mouth, and the sight in one eye was lost forever. The severe head injury also affected her ability to move. Nerve damage left her partially paralyzed. She no longer had control over her lower body, and months of rehabilitation lay ahead. But something even more profound had changed in Ava, her spirit. Instead of the fear she'd felt before the gunshot, she was now seething with rage, not just at her own suffering, but at the fact that it had all been made possible by racism and the power the police officer had abused. Michelle, the social worker who supported Ava, sat next to her bed, trying to find words of comfort. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You're a victim not just of this one cop, but of an entire system that has gone too long without being held accountable for its actions." Ava, looking at the ceiling, barely moved her lips. "He didn't see me as a person, he only saw my skin." Michelle nodded, understanding her feelings. Beneath her professional poise lay the same pain that Ava felt, the pain of racial injustice that ran deep in society. "We will fight, Ava," she said, her voice full of determination. "We will fight for you and for all those who have suffered under this system. You are not alone." Ava was silent, her eyes still staring into the void, but something new was flaring up inside her. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain. It was anger and a desire for justice. After the shot, time seemed to stand still. Ava lay on the cold asphalt, her body unresponsive, and her vision blurred. The sounds merged into a dull buzz, but at that very moment, her mind clearly grasped one thing: the policeman had not even come closer to help her. He had not bent down to check if she was alive, or tried to stop the bleeding. He had simply stood there, as if none of this mattered. The policeman, the same white cop Ava would always remember, calmly holstered his gun, as if he had done his duty. His face remained expressionless, as if it was just another day on the job. His eyes showed no regret, no fear, only cold indifference. He glanced at Ava, as if assessing the result of his order. Her body lay on the sidewalk, weakly twitching in convulsions, blood slowly flowing from the wound on her head, mixing with the dirt on the road. The officer sighed, reached for his radio, and calmly reported, "The suspect has been neutralized. An ambulance is required." No mention of him shooting an unarmed young woman who was trying to obey his orders. No mention of the racist rage that drove his actions. To him, it was just another neutralized threat. There was no doubt in his mind that he might have made a mistake. In his mind, she was not a person, but an object, a black figure who had to be stopped, even if it meant shooting. He didn't approach Ava, didn't call for help right away. His actions were slow and deliberately distant, as if he didn't want to touch on what, in his opinion, was unworthy of attention. People passing by stopped in horror. Someone started screaming. A woman with a child in her arms dropped her bag and, covering her face with her hand, screamed, "Oh my God, she's still alive. Do something." The crowd began to gather around, slowly but surely. People took out their phones, filmed what was happening. Someone started calling an ambulance. Someone shouted indignant words at the policeman. But he stood like a rock, unperturbed, as if what was happening did not concern him. His job was done, and he did not see any tragedy in what had happened. "Hey! What are you doing?" A man from the crowd shouted, stepping forward. "She's dying. You have to help her." But the officer just waved him away, as if he were an annoying insect, without even deigning to look at the man. He didn't move or make any attempts to approach Ava. Perhaps in his eyes she was just another threat who got what she deserved. The crowd grew larger and angrier. People began shouting accusations and questions filled the space. "You just shot her? Was she armed? She was just walking down the street. It's because she's black, right?" The words cut the air like knives, but the policeman didn't react. His face remained impassive. He simply stood next to the car, waiting for backup, as if this was all routine, as if he shot unarmed people on the street every day. Minute by minute, Ava slowly lost consciousness. Her gaze wandered absently over the assembled people, their faces distorted with terror. She heard their screams, but she could not understand their words. Her breathing became weaker and weaker, and deep down she knew that if help did not come, she would die right here on the cold asphalt. It seemed like an eternity before the ambulance arrived. The paramedics rushed toward Ava, urged on by the crowd, but the policeman didn't even move. He watched from afar, as if this was just a scene in a movie and not his real responsibility. "Another racist cop," someone in the crowd shouted, and the cry was taken up by others. The shouts grew louder, the crowd grew tense. People blamed the policeman, seeing in his actions not only personal cruelty, but also a reflection of the entire system, a system that time and again protected people like him, covering up their crimes. But the officer remained unperturbed. He had done his job and was not going to take part in it anymore. He already knew that the support of his colleagues would be on his side, that the system would always cover him. People like him were not afraid of the consequences. After all, they knew that people like Ava, black, unarmed, defenseless, always lose in this game. Michelle, a social worker, told Ava about it later when she was in hospital recovering from surgery. "He didn't even try to help you," Michelle said bitterly, her voice laced with anger. "This man saw you not as a person, but as a threat simply because of the color of your skin. And that's not an accident, Ava. It's a system that has used violence against people like you for centuries." Ava listened silently. There was no longer any fear in her soul. Now there was anger and a desire for justice boiling there. "I won't let him get away with this," she said quietly but firmly. "He didn't just shoot me. He shot all of us." Those words that were spoken that day were the beginning of her struggle. Ava lay on the cold asphalt, her breathing ragged, almost imperceptible, but she was alive. The world around her was foggy, but she still felt it. Every breath was painful, every heartbeat was difficult. Blood flowed slowly from the wound on her head, filling the street with dark spots, but in the depths of her mind there was one desire: to survive. The crowd around her grew louder, but Ava heard it all as if through a thick layer of water. Screams, accusations, shock all merged into a single hum. People crowded around, watching what had happened, and someone tried to give her first aid, but the policeman did not move, did not approach her, did not extend a helping hand. His indifference was frightening, his face remained stony. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, but for Ava, those minutes seemed like an eternity. She felt her life slowly slipping away, each breath becoming harder and harder, but some unknown force made her fight. Her body spasmed weakly, as if her body refused to give in. The medics ran out of the car, piercing the space with their desperate cries. "Get out of the way! Make room!" People began to move aside in panic, making way for the doctors. They quickly approached Ava, leaned over her, checking her pulse and assessing her condition. One of them said, apparently to his colleagues, "She's alive. There's a lot of blood loss, but she's breathing." The words struck the crowd like thunder. Someone from the bystanders whispered, "She survived. Oh my God, she's still alive." The cries of indignation gradually began to give way to bated breaths as people watched the doctors quickly and professionally provide first aid to Ava. One of the nurses panicked when she saw the amount of blood, but the head doctor, a man with a short gray haircut, said loudly, "Calm down, she's strong, we'll make it in time." They secured a cervical collar around her neck to stabilize the damaged vertebrae and began treating the head wound to stop the bleeding. Ava, who lay motionless, could still feel the cold of the instruments on her skin. but her strength was draining away and she was sinking into complete numbness. The policeman, the officer who had fired the shot, stood to the side, watching the medics bustle about. He didn't move, didn't show the slightest interest in what was happening to the girl whose body was now fighting for life. When one of the paramedics, a young black man named Jamal, gave the policeman a disapproving look, he just shrugged, as if none of this had anything to do with him. "Are you serious?" Jamal couldn't help but look back at the cop, whose face remained impassive. "You're standing here like nothing happened? She's dying." The policeman didn't even bother to answer. He just looked away, slowly returning his hand to his belt where his holster hung. "We do our job," he said dryly. "I've done mine." Jamal shook his head, looking at the cop with disdain. "Your job? This is your job? Shooting an unarmed girl?" he shouted, not holding back his emotions. "Look at her. You almost killed her, and you don't care?" The crowd took up his words. People around him began shouting curses and accusations. Angry bystanders clenched their fists. Someone threw a plastic bottle at the policeman, who remained standing with the same impassive expression. His cold gaze ran over the crowd, but he showed neither fear nor embarrassment. "Stay away from me," he called over his shoulder, then turned to his colleagues, who were just beginning to arrive on the scene. Meanwhile, the medics carefully lifted Ava onto the stretcher, continuing to check her pulse and condition. Her consciousness faded in and out. In brief moments of clarity, she saw blurry images around her, faces, silhouettes, flashes of light, but the pain pulsing in her head reminded her that she was still alive. Alive despite the bullets and the indifference of the one who was supposed to protect her. In the ambulance, as she was being placed on a gurney, she felt Michelle, a social worker, on her hand. Michelle, miraculously on the scene, whispered softly, "Hold on, Ava, you're strong, we won't let them hide it." These words sounded like a ray of light in the darkness for Ava. She could no longer respond, but a small flame burned inside her. She knew she had to survive, not just for herself, but for all this injustice to finally come to light, for the voice of her pain and rage to be heard. As the ambulance sped away, leaving people on the street, the policeman finally turned to his colleagues who had just arrived. One of them, younger and less confident, approached him and asked quietly, "What happened? Did you really shoot her?" "She disobeyed orders," he replied dryly, as if it were a simple fact. "I did what I had to do." The cop knew what he was doing. Every move, every command, was deliberate, calculated. He could have said it was instinct, to protect himself from the threat he thought Ava posed, but deep down, he knew there was no threat. He fired not because he feared for his life, but because he was accustomed to seeing black faces as threats, guilty by default. As the crowd began to gather around him, his confidence didn't waver. The anger and shock in the eyes of the bystanders was palpable. People shouting, pointing at his gun and the bloody stain that was slowly growing around the girl lying on the pavement. He stood there, looking at them with cold disdain, trying to maintain control of the situation. In his mind, this was still part of the job, a normal day on patrol, but the truth was, he didn't call an ambulance right away. He stood there and waited for others to do it, anyone but him. Passers-by, seeing Ava on the ground covered in blood, immediately sprang into action. One woman rushed to the phone, dialing 911, while others tried to stop the bleeding. "She's breathing, but she needs help right away," one of the women shouted, sitting next to Ava, who was lying half-conscious. Her shaking hands tried to cover the wound, blood oozing from between her fingers. Screams could be heard from the other end of the street. "Where is the ambulance? Has anyone called an ambulance?" The man in the suit, who had probably witnessed everything, approached the policeman with an expression of fury on his face. "Are you not going to do anything? You should have called for help right after the shot." The policeman didn't blink or move. He glanced briefly at the man and replied indifferently, "I called her. They are already on their way. I did everything according to the instructions." It was a lie. In fact, he knew he hadn't called an ambulance right away, even though he could have. He knew his actions would be questioned, but he had a ready-made version of events. The girl had disobeyed orders. He had acted within the scope of his job, protecting himself from a potential threat. Everything would look perfect in his report. No one would notice the delay in calling for help. The man didn't believe a word the cop said. His eyes flashed with anger. "You shot an unarmed girl and didn't even bother to help her." The policeman didn't answer. His gaze was directed ahead, past the man. At the crowd, which was growing increasingly heated, someone threw a plastic bottle in his direction. Others shouted insults. He could see that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but he was in no hurry to leave. He stood there with a stony expression, as if what was happening did not concern him personally. The crowd grew. People passing by took out their phones, filming every moment. The whole street was buzzing with indignant voices. "This is racism. He just doesn't care about us," a young girl shouted from her phone. "He didn't call an ambulance on purpose so that she would die," came from the other end of the crowd. But the cop already knew how to explain all this. In his report, it would look like this: he was acting within the law, protecting his life. When the girl started moving, he perceived it as a potential threat. It didn't matter that Ava's backpack contained only her documents and textbooks. It didn't matter that she was trying to prove her innocence. In his eyes, she was dangerous only because she was black and didn't obey orders as quickly as he deemed necessary. When the ambulance finally arrived, it wasn't because he'd called. Bystanders couldn't stand by any longer. It was they, the ordinary people who saw this injustice, who made sure Ava got help. The medics rushed to her side, their faces and hands covered in her blood as they tried to stop the bleeding and stabilize her. As the medics bent over Ava, checking her pulse, the officer slowly stepped aside. He felt no guilt, although he knew his actions would cause a wave of indignation. In his mind, this was all business as usual. The system would always have his back, as it had others before him. They won't understand, he thought of the crowd. To him, they were distant from the real work he was doing. In his mind, he was doing his duty. But to those around him, to those who looked at Ava, battered and bleeding on the pavement, he was more than just a cop. He was a symbol of the very system that had used its power time and time again to punish and oppress, especially those whose skin was different from his. The cop knew what he was doing. Every move, every command, was deliberate, calculated. He could have said it was instinct, to protect himself from the threat he thought Ava posed. But deep down, he knew there was no threat. He fired not because he feared for his life, but because he was accustomed to seeing black faces as threats, guilty by default. As the crowd began to gather around him, his confidence didn't waver. The anger and shock in the eyes of the bystanders was palpable. People shouting, pointing at his gun and the bloody stain that was slowly growing around the girl lying on the pavement. He stood there, looking at them with cold disdain, trying to maintain control of the situation. In his mind, this was still part of the job, a normal day on patrol. But the truth was, he didn't call an ambulance right away. He stood there and waited for others to do it, anyone but him. Passers-by, seeing Ava on the ground covered in blood, immediately sprang into action. One woman rushed to the phone, dialing 911, while others tried to stop the bleeding. "She's breathing, but she needs help right away," one of the women shouted, sitting next to Ava, who was lying half-conscious. Her shaking hands tried to cover the wound, blood oozing from between her fingers. Screams could be heard from the other end of the street. "Where is the ambulance? Has anyone called an ambulance?" The man in the suit, who had probably witnessed everything, approached the policeman with an expression of fury on his face. "Are you not going to do anything? You should have called for help right after the shot." The policeman didn't blink or move. He glanced briefly at the man and replied indifferently, "I called her. They are already on their way. I did everything according to the instructions." It was a lie. In fact, he knew he hadn't called an ambulance right away. Even though he could have, he knew his actions would be questioned, but he had a ready-made version of events. The girl had disobeyed orders. He had acted within the scope of his job, protecting himself from a potential threat. Everything would look perfect in his report. No one would notice the delay in calling for help. The man didn't believe a word the cop said. His eyes flashed with anger. "You shot an unarmed girl and didn't even bother to help her." The policeman didn't answer. His gaze was directed ahead, past the man. At the crowd, which was growing increasingly heated, someone threw a plastic bottle in his direction. Others shouted insults. He could see that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but he was in no hurry to leave. He stood there with a stony expression, as if what was happening did not concern him personally. The crowd grew. People passing by took out their phones, filming every moment. The whole street was buzzing with indignant voices. "This is racism. He just doesn't care about us," a young girl shouted from her phone. "He didn't call an ambulance on purpose so that she would die," came from the other end of the crowd. But the cop already knew how to explain all this. In his report, it would look like this: he was acting within the law, protecting his life. When the girl started moving, he perceived it as a potential threat. It didn't matter that Ava's backpack contained only her documents and textbooks. It didn't matter that she was trying to prove her innocence. In his eyes, she was dangerous only because she was black and didn't obey orders as quickly as he deemed necessary. When the ambulance finally arrived, it wasn't because he'd called. Bystanders couldn't stand by any longer. It was they, the ordinary people, who saw this injustice, who made sure Ava got help. The medics rushed to her side, their faces and hands covered in her blood as they tried to stop the bleeding and stabilize her. As the medics bent over Ava, checking her pulse, the officer slowly stepped aside. He felt no guilt, although he knew his actions would cause a wave of indignation. In his mind, this was all business as usual. The system would always have his back, as it had others before him. They won't understand, he thought of the crowd. To him, they were distant from the real work he was doing. In his mind, he was doing his duty. But to those around him, to those who looked at Ava, battered and bleeding on the pavement, he was more than just a cop. He was a symbol of the very system that had used its power time and time again to punish and oppress, especially those whose skin was different from his. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics jumped out of the vehicle, their faces tense. One of the paramedics, Jamal, was the first to notice that a young black girl was lying on the ground, bleeding profusely. His heart sank when he saw the extent of the damage, the blood running down the pavement. Ava's lifeless gaze, shock and alarm flashed across the faces of the entire medical team. "Damn, we're going to lose her if we don't hurry," Jamal said to his colleagues, quickly rushing towards the girl. They acted immediately, checking her pulse and stabilizing her breathing while covering the wound on her head. The doctors exchanged worried glances. The situation was critical, and every second mattered. But at that moment, the same policeman approached the ambulance. His steps were measured, calm, as if he was confident in every move. His cold gaze studied the medics who were trying to save Ava's life. He seemed not to notice the panic and haste with which they worked. "What happened?" asked the head doctor, without looking up from his work. The policeman, without showing any emotion, said, "She refused to follow my orders. I was forced to use force. I defended myself." The doctors looked at each other. Their faces were frozen in bewilderment and indignation. Jamal, continuing to work with Ava, said with irritation and contempt, "Use force? You call that defense? She's unarmed. You shot her in the head." The policeman's expression did not change. It was as if he had not heard the accusation in Jamal's voice. He repeated his dry, pre-rehearsed story. "She resisted. I gave her some clear instructions, but she refused to comply. It was a threat to me and those around me. I acted according to protocol." The medics continued their work, trying to save Ava, but it was clear that they were shocked by his words. The policeman tried to justify his brutal behavior, seeing nothing unusual in it. One of the medics, an elderly woman with a short gray haircut who had been working on calls for many years, turned to the officer, her face distorted with indignation. "You shot her in the head. She wasn't even a threat. Where is your humanity?" The officer merely shrugged, as if these words had no meaning to him. His face remained as cold and indifferent as ever. "I was doing my duty," he replied, looking the medic straight in the eye, "and now I need medical attention. My actions were aimed at protecting myself. I'm stressed. I think it would be best if you took me to the hospital. It's part of the procedure." The ambulance was confused. Jamal seemed ready to explode with indignation, his gaze directed straight at the policeman. "Do you seriously think this is about you right now?" Jamal asked, seething with anger. "The girl you almost killed is lying here, between life and death, and you're asking us to take you to the hospital because of stress?" The officer didn't react. He was adamant, as if the situation was completely under his control. Everything that had happened, in his mind, was part of his job, protecting himself, doing his duty. All of this justified his actions, his cruelty and indifference. "Yes," the policeman answered calmly. "I followed instructions, and now I need help." The medics were confused, especially those who had seen the state Ava was in. They knew they had a real victim in front of them, but the system dictated its own rules. They could only follow protocols. And now, as absurd as it seemed, the officer who had nearly killed the girl was demanding attention. Jamal was on the verge of a breakdown, but his colleague put her hand on his shoulder, reminding him that their first priority was saving Ava's life. "We're doing this for her," she whispered. They had no right to linger. Ava was quickly lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into an ambulance. The policeman, without an ounce of remorse, was already preparing to follow them to the hospital. But one thing became clear to all witnesses: this man had no sympathy. Inside the ambulance, the medics were desperately fighting for Ava's life. Jamal, the paramedic, was focused on her condition, carefully monitoring her every breath. The girl had lost a lot of blood, and her chances of survival were decreasing with each passing minute. Jamal leaned over to his colleague working next to her. "We need blood urgently, otherwise she won't survive to the hospital. The loss is enormous." His voice trembled with tension. "We don't have the right group in stock," the nurse whispered, fear in her voice. Ava lay motionless, her face covered in blood, her eyes closed, but the machine she was hooked up to showed that she was still struggling. Every moment was important to her. Jamal couldn't accept that the girl was dying right in his arms. He pounded on the side of the ambulance, shouting to the driver, "Come on, hurry up, she won't last." The nurse, desperately trying to find a vein to inject Ava with medication, noticed her hand tremble slightly. It was a weak sign of life, but still a sign. "She's still with us," she said with a heavy sigh. "We can't lose her, we just can't." Jamal, feeling that time was running out, began calling the nearest hospital to reserve blood for a transfusion, but because of the rare blood type, there was not much in stock. He was told that the hospital had already started looking for donors, but it was taking time. "We don't have that time," Jamal snapped, but he couldn't afford to lose his composure. He leaned toward Ava again, watching her readings. Meanwhile, the policeman back at the station sat at his desk, filling out his report. He was methodical, writing down every detail of the day. His report made the story sound simpler than it actually was. He described his actions as self-defense. A couple of paragraphs, and it all looked like it was a routine operation. The shooting was justified. The order was given. The girl disobeyed. "I warned her," he wrote. "I repeated the command twice. She ignored my orders and made a sudden movement. This made me suspicious, and I was forced to act according to protocol to protect myself and those around me." He pressed the enter key, finishing his report. There was no doubt in his mind that it all looked right. His version of events was short, without unnecessary emotion. As the system demanded, the whole situation was reduced to a few lines of formal text. The policeman leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes, feeling tired. Everything that had happened, in his opinion, was just another unpleasant part of his job. No feelings of guilt or regret came. Footsteps could be heard in the hallway as other officers came and went, each going about their own business, oblivious to the recent incident. The incident had not caused much of a stir in the department. Shootings of suspects, especially black ones, were not uncommon. One of his colleagues, looking into his office, asked with an indifferent expression on his face, "Is everything okay? Did you fill out the report?" "Yes, everything is ready," the policeman replied, standing up. "Now I'll just go to the hospital. They have to examine me there." "Well, of course," the colleague chuckled. "Don't worry, the protocol will cover it." The policeman nodded and headed for the exit. He was sure that what he had done was the right thing. To him, Ava was just another figure on his list. No one at the station saw anything unusual in this event. Everything he had done had to be part of the duty. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, doctors were preparing for an emergency blood transfusion. Ava was brought to the operating table, her body almost completely drained of blood. Surgeons gathered around, ready to operate. "We need more blood," one of the doctors shouted. "Her condition is critical." They did everything they could to stabilize her. At one point, one of the surgeons, a young man, stopped when he saw her battered face. "How could it be so cruel?" he whispered, barely holding back his emotions. But despite desperate attempts, time was too short. The doctors in the operating room worked tirelessly to save Ava's life. Time was their worst enemy. Every second her condition worsened. Doctors urgently stabilized her blood circulation, finally obtaining donor blood for a transfusion. The bullet lodged deep in her head posed a serious threat, and the surgeons knew that the operation would be difficult and dangerous. The operating room was tensely silent, broken only by the voices of doctors and the sounds of medical equipment. The chief surgeon, Dr. Kim worked with concentration, trying to carefully remove the bullet without damaging the vital vessels. Around him, assistants passed instruments, and nurses monitored the condition of the girl, who was fighting for her life on the brink of death and salvation. "Be careful," said Dr. Kim. "The bullet is too close to the cranial artery. Any careless movement could be fatal." Ava's face and skull, however, the main task to save her life, was accomplished. Dr. Kim, putting away the instruments, sighed heavily. "We did everything we could. Now her future is in the hands of God, or luck." Despite saving her life, Ava's face was left irreparably scarred. The bullet had passed through her jaw and cheekbone, shattering bone and tissue, leaving deep scars. When doctors finished their work, her face was left with a complex network of stitches. All they could do was try to reconstruct her face as best they could, but there was no such thing as a perfect reconstruction. A few days after the surgery, Ava was still in critical condition, but had begun to breathe on her own. When she regained consciousness, the world around her was a blur. Her body felt heavy from all the interventions, but the biggest shock came when she touched her face for the first time. Pain and horror lanced through her as her fingers felt the rough line of stitches and the asymmetrical shape of her jaw. What's wrong with me?" she croaked, barely able to find the words. The nurse on duty at her bed quickly approached. "Please don't touch the stitches. You've had a major operation." Ava couldn't hold back her tears. She felt like her life would never be the same. The memories of that day, the policeman's screams, the gunshot, the fall to the pavement, all of it came back to her in waves of horror. But now there was a new feeling added to it, fear of what she would see when she looked in the mirror. "I want to see myself," she whispered, and although the nurse tried to stop her, she was adamant. When the nurse brought a small mirror, Ava hesitated for a moment, not daring to look. Taking the mirror in her hands, she slowly raised it to her face. What she saw made her freeze in horror. Her face was no longer her own. Deep scars and distorted features made her appearance unfamiliar. She pushed the mirror away and began to sob. "It wasn't me. It wasn't me." Meanwhile, the policeman sat in his chief's office, discussing the incident again. He knew his report had been reviewed and now it was just a matter of going through the formalities. The chief, a stone-faced man, leafed through the papers, nodding at each page. "So," the chief said, finally raising his head, "everything was done according to protocol. Did she really disobey orders?" The policeman nodded, maintaining the same cold tone. "Yes, she was acting aggressively, and then she made a sudden move. I had to protect myself." The boss nodded approvingly, putting his signature on the documents. "Good, you did the right thing. The system will cover you. Sometimes you have to take tough measures. You know that. She could have been a threat." The policeman nodded again, although inside he had no doubts or remorse. Everything looked clean and logical on paper. To him, this was just one incident of many, unlikely to have serious consequences. He knew that justice would be on his side, as always. But for Ava, it was different. Every day, lying in her hospital room, she faced a new reality: physical pain, the pain of losing her old self, and the fear of a future that now seemed so unknown. Her life was divided into before and after, and all because of one person who saw her not as a person, but as a threat, simply because of the color of her skin. Several months had passed since the day Ava first opened her eyes in the hospital room, and she was finally allowed to return home. However, the word home no longer brought her the warm feelings it once did. The world around her had changed forever, and she felt as if even the walls of her home, which were supposed to give her peace, had become strange. When she left the hospital, the crumpled white discharge paper in her hand seemed like a symbol of her new beginning. But what would it be? She could no longer return to her old life. Ava felt that her existence was now confined to the day that was forever imprinted in her memory like ink. It was cold outside, the autumn wind ruffled her hair, and the hood covered her disfigured face to hide the scars from prying eyes. Her face always reminded her of that night of the gunshot, the screams, and the indifference of the policeman who left her to die. Ava had long since realized that her appearance would never be the same. Her face was distorted by the surgery. Scars and uneven stitches pulled at the skin, making her face asymmetrical and disfigured. And although the doctors did everything they could, she knew that now her reflection would always remind her of the horror she had experienced. She couldn't forget that day. Never. It became her constant companion. Like her scars, That date turned into a bright, painful marker, dividing her life into before and after. On the day of her discharge, her mother, Linda, met her at the hospital exit. The woman tried to smile, but there was worry and deep sadness in her eyes. She hugged her daughter, trying not to touch her face so as not to cause her any more pain. Linda knew that their lives had changed forever, and although she tried to be strong for Ava, inside she felt an enormous weight. "Are you ready?" the mother asked quietly, looking at her daughter, as if she was asking not about the trip home, but about whether Ava would be able to live a normal life again. Ava just nodded. She felt like a stranger in her own body, as if the gunshot had not only physically disfigured her, but also robbed her of something important that made her herself. In public, she hid her face under a hood or large scarves, but every time someone accidentally glanced at her, she felt judgment and fear. These were not the looks she was used to before, when she was a carefree, smiling girl. Now she was seen differently, as a victim, and she hated it. When they got home, Ava stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway. It was large, reflecting her entire silhouette. She couldn't bring herself to move closer, but her gaze was caught by the reflection. The scars were ugly and loud, like symbols of pain and fear. She felt her heart squeeze with horror and self-loathing. Mother came up from behind, placing her hand on Ava's shoulder. "You're strong," Linda said softly. "You'll survive." But Ava couldn't believe those words. Her head was still filled with the screams, the moments before the shot, when she argued with the policeman who refused to see her as a human being. It all sat deep inside her, like a poison that was slowly eating away at her soul. Life after the hospital was difficult. Ava could no longer go outside without feeling the gaze of passers-by. She was avoided, pointed at, and sometimes she heard whispers behind her. Even children on the street looked at her face with horror, which only increased the feeling of isolation. She avoided mirrors, unable to look at her reflection without tears. Every night she woke up from nightmares. In them, she would find herself on that street again and again, hearing the cold voice of the policeman, the orders that echoed in her head, and then again feeling the deafening impact of the bullet and the fall onto the cold asphalt. Sometimes she would even hear his footsteps after the shot, measured and indifferent. He was in no hurry. He didn't care. With each passing day, Ava tried to gather the strength to move on. But what kind of life was that? Her future seemed bleak, and although she had physically survived, emotionally she was still in that moment, in that nightmare. Those around her saw her as a symbol of the fight against police brutality, but inside she felt torn apart. One evening, sitting by the window and looking at the twilight, Ava realized that her life would truly never be the same. She had to rebuild her identity, find the strength to live with these scars, not only on her face, but also on her heart. Several months had passed since Ava had left the hospital. Time seemed to move slowly, but her emotional wounds were not healing as quickly as she would have liked. She continued to live in a world where every day she was reminded of the gunshot, the policeman's scream, the cold indifference. Her face remained disfigured, but the pain that tore her apart from the inside was even more devastating. She rarely left the house, trying to avoid crowded places. Every time she saw her reflection, she felt like the girl she was before the gunshot was gone forever. The scars not only covered her face, but also cut through her heart, changing her view of the world. There was too much pain, too many memories that could not be erased. One evening, Ava sat on the balcony of her apartment, wrapped in a warm blanket. The autumn wind blew coolly on her face, but it was the rare silence she had come to appreciate. The city was distant and noisy, but here, on the balcony, she managed to find a little peace. She looked at the fireflies of lights far below, and her thoughts returned once again to the day that had become a turning point in her life. The memories came flooding back to her: the policeman, his harsh voice, his orders, his face filled with cold contempt. He didn't see her as a person, just a target, an object. He felt no regret or compassion after the shot, and it drove Ava crazy. He was sure he had done the right thing by following his instructions, but her life was ruined forever. She couldn't understand how this was possible, how one moment could turn her life into this endless nightmare. The policeman seemed far away from her. His world remained the same, while she tried to survive in her new body, in her new reality. Despite all this, Ava began to find the strength to move on. It was a struggle, every day, every look at her face, every step out into the street where strangers' eyes looked at her. But she didn't want to be a victim anymore. Yes, She was left permanently crippled, but she decided that her life would not be defined by one shot. This would not be the end of her story. Over time, Ava began writing. She expressed her feelings, fears, and pain on paper, as if each paragraph she wrote helped release some of her suffering. Her writing became a voice for those who could not tell their stories, whose lives were destroyed just like hers. People began reading her work, and many found reflections of their own traumas in it. Her voice became important. People began to listen to her. She was no longer just a victim of police violence. She became a symbol of the fight for justice. Ava still bore the scars on her face, but now they were not just bullet scars, but symbols of her resilience, her strength, and her ability to overcome the horrors of her past. As time went on, Ava gradually learned to accept herself for who she was. Her face would never be the same. Her life would never return to what it was before the gunshot, but she now knew that strength wasn't always about appearing unscathed. True strength was about overcoming pain, fear, and injustice, and moving forward despite it all. And while that day would forever be a part of her story, she no longer let it define her life. She was now writing her own destiny, and it was not a story of a victim, but of a survivor. Ava's story comes to an end. I want to thank you for being with me on this journey. This story is not only about pain and suffering, but also about strength, resilience, and hope. I hope you found something in it that resonated with you, and perhaps it will inspire you to reflect on the importance of justice and human dignity. Thank you for your attention and for allowing this story to be part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Until next time.